Episode 1. The Graveyard Answered First. The first time Lucia prayed in that language, the graveyard gate creaked open on its own. It was past midnight in the convent of Santa Leona. The wind was still, and the candles in the chapel refused to flicker. But Lucia, 17, untouched by the world, and whispered by many to be favored by heaven, was on her knees before the altar, whispering something no one had ever taught her. Not Latin, not Spanish, not any language that had ever been sung within those chapel walls. It slithered, it pulsed, it cracked from her throat like the snapping of old bones. At first, Sister Magda thought she was sleep-talking, until the crucifix above the altar fell. It didn't slide, it snapped. The wooden Christ slammed into the floor with such violence that every candle in the chapel went out in an instant. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. Lucia didn't move. Her hands remained folded, her eyes closed tight, but tears leaked sideways down her cheeks. She whispered again. Sister Magda dared to step closer. The young virgin's lips moved delicately, reverently. The language sounded wrong and profane. No, worse, ancient, hungry. It was not meant to be spoken by the living. Then came the knock. It echoed through the chapel like a hammer on a tombstone. Not at the door. It came from below. The two women stood in a centuries-old convent, built over catacombs, graves, and secrets the Vatican had long forgotten. And now, beneath their feet, someone, or something, was knocking from underneath the floor. Lucia stopped speaking. A wind, cold and dry like funeral breath, slapped through the chapel. Later that night, Sister Elena, the archivist, inspected the graveyard outside. She found the wrought iron cemetery gate wide open. No signs of struggle, no tracks, just open, and at the farthest Bishop Cauldron's lid had been slid off. Half open, dirt scattered like it had been clawed from within. The bishop had been dead for 97 years. I mourn him. Lucia remembered nothing, or so she claimed. They asked her about the language. What language? She whispered, staring at the wooden floor. The one you prayed in? I don't know any language but ours. I was praying the Ave Marcha. They showed her the broken crucifix. She wept, genuinely. Her hands trembled as she held the splintered wood. When she kissed it, the wound on Christ's side began to leak, again, sticky and unmistakably warm. From that day, no one dared pray beside her. The other girls moved their beds away in the dormitory. Even the statue of Saint Cecilia in the hallway had cracked at the ice like it had wept marble tears during the night. But Lucia, she kept praying, always alone, always softly, and when no one watched, her mouth would move, even as she slept. That night, Sister Elena made a quiet note in her journal. It is not heaven that listens when she prays. It is not hell either. It is something older, something buried, and now it knows her name. Episode 2. The Nun Who Burned Her Rosary. The last time Sister Magda held a rosary, it burned her, not in a metaphorical, poetic way. No, it scorched her palm like iron pulled from hell's own fire. It happened nights after Lucia's first prayer. The convent had grown quieter, but heavier, like every breath cost more than it should. Whispers moved through the halls like mist, clinging to robes, curling into the ears of the sleepless. But no one spoke of her, not aloud. Lucia, the virgin girl with sleep-stitched lips entombing prayers. Sister Magda had seen things. 40 years in this convent had taught her how to ignore strange happenings. But not this time. The chapel felt wrong. The walls listened, and Lucia's prayers no longer echoed the absorbed. She decided that night to cleanse the chapel. Magda placed her old rosary when blessed by a bishop long buried onto the altar. Her plan was simple, a prayer, a hymn, holy water. Perhaps Lucia had accidentally spoken a demonic tongue. Perhaps it was nothing but delirium. Perhaps. But as she knelt, her hand touched the rosary and screamed. The beads seared into her skin, branding a perfect circle of blisters into her palm. She threw it down, panting, backing away. But it was too late. Blood welled beneath the blisters in the shape of something not human. Not quite. It looked like an eye. Lucia watched from the back pew, unnoticed. Her lips moved slowly, silently. Sister Magda didn't see her, but she felt her. That night, the rosary vanished. Magda didn't misplace it. She buried it behind the chapel under moonlight. whispering Hail Marys with one trembling hand and clutching her bandaged palm with the other. But the next morning, it was hanging in her room, clean, polished, and dripping, not water, wax. By noon, Sister Magda demanded that Lucia be taken to the priest in the village. But Father Ezekiel sent only a message. If she speaks the dead tongue, she is not possessed. She is marked. I will not intervene. Magda couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the rosary dangling above her bed like a pendulum, swaying gently even when the air was still. She tried to ignore it until the night she heard singing, a single voice, beautiful, haunting, coming from the cemetery. She opened her window. Lucia was kneeling at the gate, facing the graves. Her hands were folded, but she wasn't speaking in tongues. She was humming. The melody wasn't from any hymn. It was deeper, lower, like something meant to lull the earth itself. And the earth, it seemed, was listening. As Magda watched, one of the tombs cracked open not violently, but delicately, like the occupant was gently peeling back the lid to listen better. Magda slammed the window and burned her rosary that night with oil and a lit candle. It screamed, not like fire, like a choir chorus of agonized whispers rising from the beads as they melted into black sludge. By morning, Magda's room reeked of ashes and wax. The only thing left was a single unburnt bead. It rolled by itself across the floor, straight toward the chapel, and from behind the door came Lucia's voice, praying, but not in Latin, not in Spanish, not even aloud. Yet Sister Magda heard every word. Episode 3, The Language Without a God. He arrived without warning, no cross, no blessing, no smile, just a leather satchel and a name that echoed like an unfinished hymn. Professor Aldous Virelli, a linguist from the Vatican archives. Though officially retired, he'd spent 40 years decoding lost tongues in forbidden tombs and had once been excommunicated for insisting that some languages should not be translated. The Mother Superior greeted him with forced courtesy, her fingers twitching near her rosary. We did not ask for a scholar. You didn't, he said, brushing dust from his coat. The church did. He requested to speak to the girl immediately. Lucia Saturday on a wooden bench in the courtyard, face tilted toward the gray sky like she was listening for something no one else could hear. When Virelli approached, she didn't look at him, but that air around her changed, sharpened, as if language itself had stopped to watch his Saturday beside her in silence. Then, do you know what you said that night in the chapel? Lucia blinked slowly. They told me I was praying. You weren't, he said. Lucia tilted her head. Then who was? That evening, Virelli asked for permission to observe her prayers. The nuns refused, so he waited until midnight, hid in the shadows of the chapel's choir loft. Lucia entered barefoot, alone, candle in hand. She walked slowly, reverently, to the altar. She knelt, and she began. No voice at first, only breath, then a murmur. Wrong, I'm wrong. It wasn't a language, not in the way we understand it. It was deeper, a rattle pulled from the cracks of forgotten graves. Virelli's mouth went dry. His ears began to ring. He wrote furiously in his notebook, but the ink bled off the pages, soaking it black. Lucia's voice rose, a single word repeated, not a word, a summon, and beneath the chapel floor, something whispered back. Virelli stumbled, dropped his pen, and fled to his quarters, hand clutching the satchel as if it were holy. By dawn, he looked 10 years older. He summoned Sister Elena and opened his notebook. What he showed her was not ink. It was etched, burned into the page, as if written with a hot nail. He whispered, "This is no human language, not Latin, not Hebrew, not Aramaic, not even the ancient liturgies of Babylon or the Black Coptic." Elena asked, voice trembling, "Then what is it?" He looked at her, eyes sunken, breath cold. "It's the tongue of those who were buried without names, the language of forgotten dead. It's a prayer never meant for heaven, because it has no God to reach." That night, Virelli stayed in his room. He locked the door, lit 7 candles, and began recording every syllable he remembered. At exactly 3:03 a.m., Sister Magda heard a knock on his door. No answer. She entered. He was gone, not dead, gone. Clothes on the chair, the window open, his journal on the desk, still warm. The last page read, She's not speaking a language. It is speaking through her. And tonight, it remembered my name. At morning, Lucia entered the chapel. She placed a single item at the altar, Virelli's crucifix. It was bent into a perfect spiral, and humming. Episode 4, she confessed to the bones. They thought Lucia prayed to God, but the bones knew better. Beneath the convent of San Leone stretched a forgotten crypto-winding labyrinth of dust, decay, and the long dead who had once whispered sermons, sung hymns, and wept prayers now erased by time. Most of the sisters refused to descend into it. Too damp, too dark, too haunted by silence. But Lucia, she walked it like she had lived there before. Sister Elena followed her one night. Not out of duty, out of dread. Lucia had stopped speaking during the day. She floated through hours as if her soul was elsewhere, lips unmoving, her eyes glassy. But at night, she moved with purpose, always barefoot, always toward the crypt. Elena kept her distance, hiding behind columns carved with forgotten saints. Lucia stepped into the central chamber where the oldest bones rested. Here, the air hung thick with stillness and rot. Time didn't pass in that room. It waited. Lucia knelt before a wall of skulls, and she whispered, not the strange tongue this time. Not at first. This was softer, personal. A confession. Forgive me, she breathed, for I remember the taste of dirt in my lungs. Elena clutched the wall. Lucia's voice grew shakier. I prayed in the wrong direction. I wept for a God that never came, so they came instead. They answered. Then her tone shifted, deeper, wronger. The strange language returned, but now it wasn't just hers. The crypt replied, a clicking, a dry sound, like bones knocking against each other. From behind the walls, beneath the floor, within the very tombs themselves, Elena's breath hitched. One skull near Lucia turned just slightly, its empty sockets angled toward the girl. Then another. One by one, the skulls began to tilt, as if listening. Lucia raised her hands in fear, but in devotion, and spoke a sentence that made the walls tremble. The dead remember their sins. They just need someone to hear their confession. The lights in the crypt, a row of flickering oil lamps, flared violently, then died. Only Lucia's voice remained. Elena fled. She burst into the chapel above, gasping, "He's bloodied." The candles lit themselves as she entered, but the crucifix had fallen again, and something had been scratched into the altar in ash. She does not need a priest. At dawn, Lucia returned to the dormitory. Mud clung to her feet. Her white gown was smeared with what looked like candle soot and something darker. Sister Elena watched her sleep that morning. She didn't dream, but her mouth moved, slowly, softly, repeating one word, absolvo, absolvo, absolvo. Later that week, a coffin was exhumed by mistake in the village cemetery. The grave diggers were heard tapping underfoot, so they opened it. Inside was a skeleton missing its jaw, but clutched in its bony hands was something freshly written on parchment. Forgive me, for I have not prayed in centuries. No one understood how it got there, but Lucia did. She smiled when she heard, and that night, she returned to the crypt with 3 candles instead of 1. She had more confessions to hear. Episode 5. The Virgin's breath made the candles cry. The candles began to weep before she ever opened her mouth. It happened during morning mass, when the sisters gathered in silence, hands folded, eyes downcast, pretending that things were still holy inside the chapel. But nothing had been holy since Lucia began to breathe differently. At morning, she entered last. Her white veil shimmered slightly in the dusty light. Her feet were bare again. She moved softly, like a ghost walking on memory. The moment she passed the altar, the candles bent, not flickered, not danced, bent, as if pushed by an unseen wind. Their wax dripped not down, but sideways. One flamed higher, then extinguished itself. A lowest whispered through the pews, like steam, like grief. Lucia Saturday folded her hands and exhaled slowly. That's when they cried. The candles cried. Wax streamed in thick, steady drops, clear at first, then red, so red it looked like blood. Sister Elena gasped when it touched her robe. It stained, not red, black. The other nuns murmured. One crossed herself, her hand shaking. Another dropped her rosary and didn't pick it up. Lucia never noticed, or pretended not to. She simply stared ahead and smiled. That night, Sister Elena examined the candles. They were untouched, cold, perfect, but when she brought one to her lips and blew gently, the wax ran again. And this time, she heard it, a whisper, from inside the flame. She breathes where we once wept. Elena dropped it. Trembling, she locked herself in the chapel office and began writing. She wrote for hours, pages and pages of everything Lucia had done, every strange moment, every ancient syllable, every unholy warmth that leaked from her skin. It was no longer a case of possession. It was something worse. Lucia was being answered. Later that week, Bishop Arden arrived, a man of old rituals and older secrets. When he entered the chapel, the air tightened. His cane tapped loudly on the stone floor, his gold ring glinting like judgment itself. He was not afraid until he saw her. Lucia stood at the altar, whispering softly to the candles. They pulsed as if they were breathing. One flame arched toward her mouth, like it longed to return to her lungs. The bishop raised his voice. "You, girl, what are you?" Lucia turned slowly, her eyes calm, her voice smooth. "I am the breath before the prayer." He stepped forward. "Silence. You are forbidden from speaking again." Lucia exhaled just once. The bishop collapsed, eyes rolled back, foam at his lips. Sister Magda screamed. It took 3 nuns to lift him. When he woke hours later, his voice was gone, his tongue blistered, and he had one phrase scrawled across his chest in candle soot. "Do not silence what the dead have remembered." The next day, no candles were lit for mass. No one dared. Lucia Saturday in the front pew, lids unmoving, and yet the air still warmed around her. One nun claimed she saw her breath glow. Another swore the Virgin Mary statue turned away when Lucia entered. By evening, the candle room was locked, but inside, wax kept dripping, even when no flame was lit, even when no one was there. Some said it was the heat. Others knew the truth. Lucia didn't pray with words anymore. She prayed with breath, and the dead had begun to breathe with her. Episode 6. The choir that sang from the coffins. It started with a hum, faint, low, like the trembling of a cello string beneath the earth. The sisters of Santa Leona heard it during morning prayers just as the sun broke over the stained glass windows, spilling colors across the chapel floor. At first, they thought it was the wind moaning through the stone walls, but the sound wasn't outside. It was beneath them. It rose from the crypts. It moved like a melody but slower, stranger, a harmony stitched from broken throats. Lucia knelt at the altar, her head bowed, unmoved, but her lips were slightly parted. Not speaking, not singing, simply open, as if catching sound or releasing it. Sister Elena felt it before she heard it clearly. A second voice, then a third, then down scenes. A choir, singing from inside the coffins. The convent erupted in confusion. Candles flickered violently. Dust fell from the rafters. One of the younger novices fainted. Another began to scream. But Lucia remained still, calm, like she'd been waiting for the dead to learn the tune. That night, Sister Elena retrieved the old voice recorder hidden in the confessional, a relic used decades ago to document whispered sins. She left it in the crypt. When she played it back hours later, the recording didn't just capture Lucia, it captured layers. Lucia's voice came first soft, breathy, impossible to understand. Then came the echoes, whispers at first, then deep, dissonant harmonies, but beneath it all, a laughter, faint, childlike, until it wasn't, until it shifted in its breath into something deeper, hollow, like lungs filled with dirt. She played it back 3 times. On the 4th, the recorder caught fire. In the days that followed, strange things began happening in the village cemetery. Several graves long sealed were found open, not dug up but pushed open from within. The corpses inside were untouched, but their mouths had changed, wider, split at the corners, as if from singing too long. Word spread, whispers of resurrection, of miracles, of blasphemy. Pilgrims came, curious strangers, even journalists, posing as priests. They all wanted to see the girl who made the dead remember their psalms. Lucia didn't speak to them, but when they came near, the chapel air would tremble. One woman claimed she saw her husband's name dead 5 years written into her prayer book after Lucia passed. Another man collapsed during Vespers, muttering a hymn in a language no one recognized. Lucia looked at him and whispered, "He remembers. He died 3 minutes later." Smiling, that evening, the organ abandoned Forders played a single note on its own, followed by a second, then a full chord. Sister Magda ran to the chapel, breathless, clutching a crucifix. What she found made her drop it. Lucia stood at the altar, eyes closed. Behind her, shadows lined the walls like figures in a procession. They didn't move, but they sang, not with mouths, not with sound, with memory. The sound crawled up the chapel walls, echoing like bones against stone. By the next morning, no one questioned it anymore. The dead had a choir, and Lucia was their conductor. No one dared speak during prayers. No one lit candles without permission, because the songs weren't meant for the living. They were rehearsals, and something was listening beneath them, something old, something buried, now humming along, and it was getting ready for a final performance. Episode 7. The priest who tried to silence God. He came in robes, soaked in incense and confidence. Father Manuel, a Vatican-trained exorcist, known for casting out demons from bodies that shook and screamed. But this girl, this quiet virgin who breathed like death and sang like a tomb, she never screamed, and that disturbed him more. He arrived under orders, not from the Pope, not from the Archdiocese, but from something more secret. A sealed letter, black wax, no signature. The only instruction: she must be silenced before the last breath is sung. Lucia didn't look at him when he entered the convent. She was sitting by the garden, eyes closed, humming a lullaby that no living mother could have ever sung. The air around her shimmered with stillness, like silence had bent to her rhythm. Father Manuel approached, crucifix raised. "You will not speak," he said. Lucia smiled gently. "I don't need to." The exorcism began in the chapel. She didn't struggle. She knelt before the altar with hands folded, head bowed. Father Manuel circled her, whispering Latin scripture with the force of a man who believed he was louder than evil itself. But Lucia began to breathe deeper, and the air turned heavy. Sister Elena watched from the farthest pew. The air around her chest constricted, as if someone invisible was pressing down. Father Manuel raised his hand, shouting the rite of expulsion. Lucia finally looked up, and she spoke, but not in defense, not in tongues, in a voice not hers. "You try to silence what may you. You shout into a grave and expect obedience. But we sang long before your churches had roofs." Father Manuel trembled. His rosary snapped. He took a step back, but his feet frowned in place. Lucia tilted her head. "Would you like to hear your own prayer?" she whispered, "the one you never said aloud." Then came the sound, Elohim, rising from beneath the chapel floor. At first faint, then deafening, hundreds of voices, all whispering one name, his, Manuel, Manuel, Manuel. And then the screams began, but they didn't come from him. They came from the walls. The old stone cracked, statues wept wax. The crucifix behind the altar turned upside down. Manuel dropped to his knees. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Lucia walked to him, knelt gently, placed her hand on his heart. "The dead forgive you," she said, "but they do not forget." They found Father Manuel the next morning, lying motionless in the center of the chapel, alive, silent. He never spoke again, but he scratched one phrase into his wall with the tip of his fingernail, over and over until his skin bled. "She speaks with the breath of God, but it is not the God we know." After that day, no priest came again. The Vatican offered no comment. Lucia resumed her prayers. Only now, when she whispered, the bells rang on their own, even when no one touched them, even when it was midnight, especially when it was midnight. Episode 8. Her body, unmarked by the earth. The fire should have killed her. It devoured the eastern wing of the convent. In less than 20 minutes, flames licked through it with like hungry tongues, swallowing walls, memories, crucifixes. Smoke poured into the sky, thick and black like the breath of something ancient waking up. But when the nuns emerged half cooking, screaming, clutching scorched rosaries, Lucia walked out last, barefoot and burned. Her white gown fluttered behind her in the ash-filled wind, spotless. Not a single ember had touched her, but the dirt on her chest told another story. It was caked across her collarbone, smeared down her arms, embedded beneath her fingernails. Not soot, not ash, soil, damp, cold, grave deep. She wasn't running from the fire. She was rising from beneath it. Sister Elena found her sitting in the chapel ruins, hands folded as if nothing had happened. "Lucia," she whispered, "are you hurt?" Lucia looked up. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but with stillness. "I wasn't in the fire," she said calmly, "but we all saw. I was below." "Below what?" Lucia's smile was soft. "Below everything." Later, when they examined the remains of the eastern wing, they discovered something impossible. The fire had started from inside the floor beneath the tiles, beneath the wood, as if it had risen rather than fallen. Worse, there were footprints in the soot, leading away from the blackened foundation barefoot, small, perfectly shaped, and next to them, a second set, larger, wider, caught, like something ancient had walked beside her, or carried her. They sent for the doctor from the village to examine Lucia. Her body temperature read below human light. She had been underground for hours. Her blood was thicker, redder, almost black. When he drew a sample, he frowned. "See, her blood has mineral traces," he stammered. "Rare ones. You only find this composition in cave systems, burial chambers." "She hasn't left the convent in years," Elena whispered. Then someone or something brought the chamber to her. That night, Lucia didn't pray. She lay in bed, eyes open, watching the ceiling, but outside, in the cemetery behind the chapel, the earth moved, graves shifted, soil pulsed, as if breathing, and from a cracked tombstone near the farthest wall, something began to hum. Not music, a heartbeat. Sister Magda couldn't sleep. She wandered the hallways, clutching her candle, muttering Hail Marys to herself. She paused outside Lucia's door. There was singing inside, but not in Lucia's voice. Many voices, deep, old, harmonizing in perfect, terrifying unison. She opened the door. Lucia was asleep, but her lips moved, barely, and across her bare chest, the dirt began to rise into pattern spirals, symbols, sigils, moving without wind, like the earth was writing on her skin. Magda stepped back, and in that moment, every candle in the convent extinguished itself. The next morning, Lucia awoke clean. No soil, no marks, no smell, but the sheets were damp, cold, like someone had pulled her from the center of the earth and laid her gently back in bed. She rose without question and whispered to the wind, "They are closer now, the ones who buried me the first time." Episode 9, The Inquisitor Who Heard His Own Funeral. He arrived cloaked in silence, dressed in black linen without a single cross. No greetings, no prayer. They called him Father Caller, Mornay, but in Vatican documents, he was marked only as Inquisitor Nullius. No origin, no parish, no past. He did not come to ask questions. He came to judge. The convent held its breath. Lucia, on the other hand, did not. She was waiting for him, as if she'd known, as if her body had already prepared his silence to meet his. Their first meeting was in the chapel. He stood. She knelt. He did not speak. She did not blink. But something passed between them in that moment of tension that pulled at the bones of the pews and made the floor creak, even though no one moved. That night, he locked himself in the northern quarters and began recording everything she had said, done, whispered, and then he made her speak, not by demand, by silence. Lucia was brought before him at dusk. No cuffs, no candles, only questions. He asked nothing out loud. He wrote one question per page. He slid it to her. She read it and then answered with no words, only breath. And every time she breathed, his pen cracked. By the 5th page, the ink turned gray. By the 7th, the pages began to bleed from the corners. He asked her name. She whispered a breath that made the room grow cold. The window fogged from the inside. He asked, "What are you?" She smiled and said nothing, but the mirror behind him cracked in the shape of a human spine. That night, the sisters heard something unnatural, a funeral procession, music, drums, a slow, rhythmic chant in a language no one alive could sing. It circled the convent, but when they looked out the windows no one was there, only shadows, moving in pairs, carrying something long and heavy, a coffin. The next morning, Father Calder did not leave his room. Sister Elena knocked. No reply. She found the door unlocked. Inside, The walls were covered in symbols drawn with what looked like dirt-covered fingers. His bed was untouched, his candles unlit, but his clothes were folded neatly on the floor. On the desk, a single paper. On it, written in black wax. I heard them carry me. I smelled the incense. I watched my own coffin lower into the soil. I did not sleep. I did not die. I was buried anyway. Lucia Saturday in the courtyard at noon. The sun didn't touch her. The light around her bent softly as if it, too, feared to reach her skin. Sister Magda asked, trembling, "Did you do something to him?" Lucia smiled gently. He judged me with silence. So the silence judged him back. That evening, bells rang at 3:33 a.m. No one pulled the rope. The sound was slow, hollow, not from the bell tower, from beneath it. From that day on, no inquisitor came again. The Vatican stopped sending letters. Lucia began praying in the chapel once more, but the words never rose above a whisper. They sank into the floor, into the walls, into the bones, and the air grew heavier, because the dead weren't listening anymore. They were gathering. Episode 10. The Psalm that killed a saint. They found it written in blood, not smeared, not spilled, written in clean, elegant script, across a page torn from a prayer book that no one remembered owning. It was placed carefully on the altar one morning, beside Lucia's favorite candle, one that never melted, the one that flickered without flame. Sister Elena was the first to see it. She read only the first line, "Blessed be the grave that sang before the womb." She dropped the page, her fingers stung with cold. The parchment hissed as it hit the stone floor. That same day, a visitor arrived, not a priest, not an inquisitor, a saint. At least, that's what they called her. Sister Aurelia, known throughout Europe as the Living Moon of Mercy. A woman said to bear Christ's stigma, whose tears once healed a child in France, and who had not slept in 23 years. A mystic, a vessel. She came not to observe. She came to redeem. They led her into the chapel in silence. Lucia stood by the altar, hands folded, head bowed as always. Sister Aurelia approached her, barefoot, robes trailing ash. "You are not evil, child," she said, her voice soft. "You were merely a door that opened wide." Lucia said nothing. Aurelia turned to the others. "She is speaking to the dead, because no one living ever truly listened." The nuns wept. Even Sister Magda stone-hearted, lowered her head. Then Aurelia saw the blood-written page on the floor. Without hesitation, she picked it up and read the full psalm aloud. The sound changed the air. It rippled, like breath caught in the lungs of the world. Her voice, usually angelic, turned coarse. Each word she spoke sounded older than her body, as if she were borrowing a throat that had once belonged to someone long buried. By the final verse, her eyes had rolled back. She whispered, "He who forgets his death shall be buried in his birth." And then she collapsed, stone dead. They buried her under the chapel that same night. Lucia did not attend the funeral, but the candles around her bed all flickered once, even only once. The next day, when Sister Elena returned to clean the chapel, she noticed something strange. The psalm was gone, but a new verse had been etched into the altar itself, burned into the wood, deep and precise. "The saints will die because they remember too much." That night, Lucia stood alone in the chapel again. She lit a single candle and sang, not in tongues, not in whispers, in the voice of Sister Aurelia. Note for note, tone for tone, the same voice that had read the cursed psalm. But Lucia wasn't mimicking, she was echoing. Somehow, she was carrying Aurelia's last breath in her lungs, and the flame in front of her danced to the rhythm of the saint's dying words. The sisters began locking the chapel doors after dusk. But it didn't matter, they still heard the singing, and when they covered their ears, the walls vibrated. Lucia no longer needed doors. She had become the chapel. She had become the psalm. And the dead, they were waiting for the final verse. Episode 11, The Virgin Who Remembered Her Death. Lucia began to speak of things she had never been taught. The names of saints whose scrolls had been lost. The burial rites of civilizations not yet uncovered. The taste of soil from beneath cities that no longer existed. She whispered them in sleep, in prayer, in silence. And then, she whispered something that silenced the entire convent. I remember the weight of the coffin lid, and the warmth chewing at my tongue. Sister Elena dropped her teacup when she heard it. "You're dreaming," she insisted, trembling, but Lucia simply looked at her, calm and ancient. "I'm not dreaming," she said. "I'm remembering. That night." She painted symbols on her bedsheets in ash and breath, the match markings found in a grave uncovered in Syria's resting place of a virgin prophet buried alive nearly 300 years before Christ. Only 3 people on earth had ever seen those symbols. Lucia had never left the convent. Elena, desperate to understand, searched the Vatican archives. She found a single, sealed file marked with the same spiral symbol that had burned itself into the altar weeks before. Inside, a sketch. A girl, 17, same face, same eyes, name erased, cause of death, executed for singing prayers to the dead in the Temple of Dust. Year, 412 A.D. She brought the file to Lucia, opened it slowly. Lucia didn't even blink. She simply whispered, "They buried me too soon that time." From that day on, Lucia stopped pretending. She didn't eat, she didn't sleep, but her body did not weaken. She stood for hours at the altar, eyes closed, lips moving, and the air around her aged. Flowers wilted, wood darkened, paint peeled. Even the marble statue of Mary began to crack in anger. But in grief, the Virgin had become a mirror, and the mirror remembered what it had once reflected. Then came the final proof. One of the oldest known Sister Rosaria fellow, Lucia Saturday beside her, took her hand and whispered in her ear. Rosaria gasped, then smiled through her tears. "You're the one from the well," she whispered. "The little girl I saw when I drowned as a child. You pulled me up with no eyes." She died minutes later, peacefully, clutching Lucia's fingers like a rosary. That night, Lucia dreamed again, but this dream was different. In it, she was kneeling beneath the chapel, surrounded by a circle of skeletons in robes. They were humming, and in the center of the circle, a coffin. Her coffin, fresh, waiting. She climbed inside, smiled, and shut the lid from the inside. She awoke gasping, not in fear, in relief, as if remembering the answer to a question that had haunted her through lifetimes. Sister Elena asked her the next morning, "Do you know who you are now?" Lucia nodded slowly. "I am not the girl who speaks to the dead," she said. "I am the girl they buried wrong." And then she said something that chilled Elena's bones. "I've been walking toward this breath for centuries, and when I release it, the earth will open again." The sisters no longer questioned her. They no longer called it heresy. They no longer prayed out loud, because the truth was simply too terrifying to deny. Lucia hadn't just remembered her own death. She had been carrying it with her. And now, she was ready to die again, but this time she would bring something back with her. Episode 12. The Day Heaven Shut Its Eyes. It happened at exactly noon. The moment Lucia stepped into the chapel, every statue turned away. Not all at once, if you like, a ripple of divine shame. Saint Francis lowered his eyes. Saint Agnes bowed her head. Even the Virgin Mary, Mother of Mercy, tilted her face to the side, her gaze suddenly refusing to meet Lucia's. And above them all, the great crucifix at the altar began to creak, then groan, then turn upside down. The sisters screamed. Some fled. Some dropped to their knees. One tore her veil off and whispered, "He has forsaken us." But Lucia simply stood in the center of it all, untouched by panic. She closed her eyes, lifted her face toward the dome above, and whispered 3 syllables. No one recognized the language, but the bells rang anyway, by themselves. A long, low toll that shook the rafters and dropped dust from the ceiling like ashes. That evening, Sister Elena found something horrifying in the old convent records. A prophecy buried in a sealed drawer, written on blue parchment with red ink. It described a girl who would pray in the language of the unrisen dead. A girl who would be mistaken for a saint and mistaken even more terribly for a demon. It ended with this line, "And on the day she breathes her final verse, the eyes of heaven will shut not in anger, but in terror." That night, no stars appeared, not a single one. The moon turned pale, like a sunken eye. Lucia stood at the balcony of the bell tower, alone, hair lifted by a wind no one else could feel. She didn't speak, but the ground began to thrum beneath the convent, not shaking, humming, like something enormous was awakening miles beneath their feet. At 3:33 a.m., every mirror in Santa Leona cracked. Even the water surface in the courtyard basin split with a jagged ripple, and in every reflection Lucia was missing. She cast no image. She was still there, standing, breathing, black to the glass. She did not exist. Sister Magda approached her in the chapel, tears in her eyes, voice hollow. "Lucia," she whispered. "If heaven had shut its eyes, what's left to see us?" Lucia turned. Slowly, heaven was never watching, she said. It was waiting. For what? Lucia smiled faintly. For me to remember how to open the other gate. By sunrise, the statues had cracked at the neck. Some fell, some bled thick, waxen trails of crimson from their eyes and mouths. A boy from the village arrived at the gates, sobbing. He said his mother had woken up from her grave, not as a ghost, not as a zombie, just awake, sitting in her coffin, singing the same melody Lucia had once hummed. The Pope was sent word, but the messenger never returned. Only his robes arrived, folded neatly at the convent gates. Inside them, a note, the voice that speaks in death, has now become the breath of the living. And that evening, for the first time, Lucia wept, but not for herself. She wept for the sky, for what had once watched her, for what had now chosen to turn away, because even heaven, it seemed, could not bear what came next. Episode 13. The gospel that should not be prayed. It wasn't written on parchment. It wasn't inked with pen or feather. It was carved into flesh. Sister Elena found it beneath Lucia's bed, hidden not on a scroll but inside her mattress, sewn into the lining with human hair. When she opened it, she screamed. The gospel had no title, no chapters, just verses carved into raw, stretched skin, still faintly warm. The letters were black, burned into the flesh as if it had been branded by prayer. And across the top, a warning written in a language no one should have been able to translate. "Pray this, and your breath will not return." Lucia was already in the chapel when they discovered it. Kneeling, eyes closed, body still, but her lips were moving again. And every time she whispered, the air grew colder not just in the room, but in the walls. Frost bloomed across the stone. Candles didn't flicker the frowsy mid-melt. And far below, in the crypt, the dead began singing in reverse. Sister Magda, desperate to end it, tried to burn the gospel. She lit it with sacred oil, placed it under the Virgin Mary statue. But instead of fire, the pages bled, thick, tar-like blood that screamed as it unsealed. And when she looked again, the gospel was back beneath Lucia's bed, unburned, still warm, still humming. That night, Lucia read the first full verse aloud. The sisters didn't hear it with their ears. They felt it with their bones. Knees buckled, nails cracked. Even the floor beneath them began to pulse, like something buried was shifting beneath the convent stone. Sister Elena clutched her chest. "Stop," she cried. "Lucia, please." But Lucia was no longer there. She was still kneeling, but her body had gone slack, breath shallow. Something else was praying through her. At 3:33 a.m., every Bible in the convent flipped open to blank pages. Every psalm erased, every verse gone, except one, a verse no one remembered writing. "In the beginning, the dead heard first." By morning, the bells were ringing again, but not from the tower, from beneath the ground, as if the earth itself had remembered a mass it had buried centuries ago and was now ready to sing again. They say Sister Clara, the youngest novice, went mad that day. She heard Lucia praying and began laughing louder and louder until it cracked into a sob. She tore at her veil, blood streaming from her ears, and shouted, "She's not reading the gospel. She's the gospel, and every breath we take now is a verse." That night, Lucia collapsed at the altar, her body cold, eyes open, but her lips still moving. Sister Elena leaned close, trembling. "Lucia," she whispered, "what are you praying for now?" Lucia blinked once, only once, and said, "The last breath, the one that never belonged to the living." When the sisters lifted her, something fell from her chest, a page, still warm, a final verse, not written in blood, but in light, a glowing script, only visible when read aloud. No one dared speak it, not yet, because deep in the catacombs, something had begun to rise, and it was listening, waiting for the final prayer, the one that would wake everything. Episode 14. the resurrection of the wronged saint. Graves are supposed to stay closed, but on the seventh night after the gospel bled, a coffin opened itself in the village cemetery. No explosion, no violence, just the sound of slowly parting wood, as if the earth had politely asked the dead to rise. And one of them agreed. They found the man wandering barefoot down the center of the convent road, skin pale, but not decayed, eyes alert, but hollow, and humming a tune no one alive could remember. When the villagers stopped him, he only asked one thing: "Where is the girl who prayed me awake?" Sister Elena stared at him from behind the chapel doors. He looked normal, ordinary, like a man who had gone to sleep and simply forgotten to stay dead. "Who are you?" she asked. He smiled with cracked lips. "I was Saint Tiberius. I died in 1786, and I was never meant to return." The room fell silent, because Saint Tiberius wasn't buried here. He was buried in Rome, yet every feature matched the Vatican paintings. The scar on his neck, the burn mark on his hand, even the chipped tooth. He was real and resurrected. When Lucia entered the room, his knees buckled. He crawled toward her like a penitent, not with fear, with adoration. "Mother," he whispered. Elena gasped. "She's not your..." But the saint shook his head. "Not of this life, of the one before the tomb. She's the one we all waited for." The final verse in the lungs of the forgotten. That night, the bells tolled 13 times. Not from above, from below. And more graves began to breathe. Not burst, breathe. Soil rising and falling, slow and steady, like lungs under dirt. The Pope was alerted, again, but this time, the message wasn't sent by man. It arrived in Rome on its own hand, written in ash on the cathedral walls. "Your saints are waking, but not for you." Lucia remained silent, but her body began to change. Her skin grew cooler, her veins darker, and around her spine, a faint shimmer like ancient script etched beneath the surface. Sister Magda begged her to stop. "To stop what?" Lucia asked softly. "To stop calling them," Magda whispered. "The dead, the saints, whatever they are." Lucia looked at her with eyes that no longer wept. "I'm not calling them. I'm answering. They've been praying too." The next day, Saint Tiberius vanished. They found only a single relic where he'd slept, a finger bone wrapped in a prayer ribbon from 1786. It pulsed with heat. It whispered Lucia's name, and across the sea, in 6 separate countries, other graves opened. All former saints, all long-dead mystics, all presumed lost, and all of them said the same thing when they were found. "She's the verse we forgot to sing." That night, Lucia Saturday before the altar once more, a single candle before her, a circle of empty robes behind her, waiting, and one final page resting in her lap, not written yet, because the last prayer had not been spoken, not until someone else took her place, because resurrection is not a gift, it is a trade, and heaven was no longer keeping the ledgers. Hell had never cared, but the dead, they remembered who was missing. Episode 15. The Virgin Who Buried Her Own Name. Lucia did not speak on the final night, not because she was afraid, but because the words had already left her. They no longer belonged to her mouth. They now lived in every grave she had ever passed, in every shadow that bent toward her breath, in every candle that had melted without flame. She had become a prayer too dangerous to say twice. The convent was silent. The sisters had locked every door. No hymns, no bells, no mass, just breathless waiting, like the walls themselves were listening for a sound no mortal ear should ever hear. Lucia knelt in the center of the chapel, the final page resting on her lap, still blank, because the last prayer hadn't been written yet. It had to be lived. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the floor began to bleed, not with blood, with ink, thick, black, ancient. It rose in veins from the stone beneath her, slithering across the chapel floor, writing itself around her knees in symbols older than Genesis. The crucifix behind her cracked once, then twice, then shattered, exploding into dust that hovered in the air like smoke refusing to fall. Sister Elena stood in the doorway, frowning. "Lucia," she whispered, "what have you become?" Lucia turned. Her voice was quiet, steady. "I became what heaven left unfinished. I became the echo of the first prayer no God dared answer." From the graveyard came a sound. Footsteps. Hundreds. Not frantic, not wild, just walking. Saints, martyrs, forgotten children. The dead had come home, and they stood at the chapel doors, waiting, not for salvation, but for Lucia's final breath. She placed her hand over the blank page, closed her eyes, and exhaled. The ink responded. It bloomed. Lines wrote themselves imperfect, weeping curves forming a prayer that had no subject, no punctuation, a gospel without a God, only a memory, and at the top, a single title appeared, for the one who remembered her death. Lucia stood, and as she did, the air broke. It didn't scream, it didn't weep, it simply shattered, like silence reaching its final note. All around her, the robes of the dead began to fall empty. The bodies that had walked from their graves had not come for life. They had come to release her, to trade her breath for the one she had borrowed, to give her what she had earned, a burial with her name restored. She walked to the altar, placed the final gospel atop the cracked stone, and whispered her name, her true name, the one lost in time, the one heaven had erased, and hell had feared, the one only the dead had carried in silence. As she spoke it, the chapel walls peeled open like flesh. Light poured in at white, not divine, but warm, like the glow of a candle remembering its first fire. The sisters found her at dawn, lying peacefully on the altar, eyes closed, lips parted, no breath, but smiling, and around her, the final gospel glowed faintly before turning to ash. No one buried her, because the earth did it on its own. Overnight, a fresh grave appeared at the farthest edge of the cemetery, unmarked, but every candle in the chapel bent in that direction. And when the wind was right, you could hear it, a girl's voice, still praying, but no longer in the language of the dead. No, now the dead had learned her tongue.